If one simple question can change your entire life, the hardest part is realizing your heart already knew the answer before your mind ever caught up. Every evening followed the same quiet rhythm until the night everything changed. I would step out of the private elevator, loosen the collar of my ivory blazer, place my keys in the crystal bowl beside the door, and hear music drifting from the kitchen before I even saw her. Lauren Brooks always claimed she cooked better when old records were playing, even if she danced terribly while making dinner. I never had the courage to tell her those clumsy little dances had become my favorite part of coming home. The world knew me as Victoria Hayes, the billionaire chief executive officer who built one of the largest technology companies in America before turning 45. Financial magazines called me fearless. Television interviews described me as disciplined. Investors admired my confidence. None of them knew the strangest truth about my life. The only place where I ever stopped pretending to have every answer was inside the penthouse I shared with my roommate. 3 years earlier, Lauren had rented the guest suite after a mutual friend introduced us. She needed a temporary place while rebuilding her interior design business. I needed someone who did not care how many companies I owned. Somehow temporary became permanent without either of us noticing. We shared grocery lists, argued over which coffee beans tasted better, watched old movies on rainy Saturdays, celebrated birthdays with homemade desserts, and quietly learned each other's habits until they felt as familiar as breathing. Friends often joked that we acted like an old married couple. We always laughed before changing the subject. That evening the city skyline glowed outside the floor-to-ceiling windows while the scent of rosemary and roasted vegetables filled the apartment. Lauren looked over her shoulder and smiled the moment she heard me walk in. "Long day?" she asked. I nodded as I placed my laptop on the dining table. Board meeting. Investor calls. 2 interviews. The usual. She slid a plate toward me before sitting across from me with her own dinner. There was something different about her that night. She smiled less. She seemed to be rehearsing invisible words inside her head. I noticed she barely touched her food. "Everything okay?" I finally asked. She looked down at her hands for several seconds before taking a slow breath. "Victoria." Her voice sounded unusually careful. "Can I ask you something crazy?" I laughed softly. "After the week I have had, I think I can survive one crazy question." She smiled, but only for a moment. Then she looked directly into my eyes with a seriousness I had never seen before. The room suddenly felt much quieter than before. Even the music seemed to fade into the background. "What if," she said slowly, choosing every word with extraordinary care, "we have spent 3 years pretending we are only roommates?" My fork stopped halfway to my plate. Every sound inside the apartment disappeared. I searched her face for a smile that would tell me she was joking, but there was none. There was only hope mixed with fear, the kind that appears when someone has already decided they would rather hear an honest answer than continue living inside a comfortable silence. My heartbeat grew louder than the city beyond the windows, because somewhere deep inside me, a truth I had spent years carefully locking away quietly whispered that Lauren had just asked the one question I had secretly been asking myself every single day. Neither of us moved. The dinner slowly cooled between us while the skyline outside the windows faded from gold to deep blue. I had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions with less tension than the silence stretching across that dining table. Lauren never looked away. She had always been brave in quiet ways. She was the kind of woman who returned a stranger's lost wallet without expecting thanks, who remembered birthdays nobody else remembered, who believed difficult conversations became heavier every day they were postponed. I realized that tonight she had finally stopped postponing one of her own. I placed my fork on the plate and folded my hands together, hoping the simple movement would hide how badly they wanted to tremble. "Why would you ask me that?" I said softly. Lauren smiled, but it was a fragile smile filled with uncertainty. "Because I cannot tell anymore where friendship ends." Her honesty settled gently over the room. I wanted to answer immediately, but my mind wandered through hundreds of ordinary memories that suddenly refused to feel ordinary. The morning she waited with hot coffee after my overnight flight from Seattle because she knew I hated airport coffee. The winter afternoon she quietly covered me with a blanket after I fell asleep reading financial reports on the couch. The countless evenings when we cooked together without speaking very much because neither of us needed words to feel comfortable. We had built a life filled with routines that never required explanations. Maybe that was why I had never questioned them. Lauren reached for her glass of water before setting it back down untouched. "Do you remember our first week living together?" she asked. I laughed quietly despite myself. "You nearly burned the kitchen trying to bake blueberry muffins." She covered her face for a second, laughing too. "And you bought a new oven before I could apologize." I smiled. "The old one was terrible anyway." "That is not true," she replied. "You just wanted me to stop feeling guilty." She was right. I had forgotten that until this moment. She looked toward the city lights beyond the glass. "Victoria, we have been taking care of each other for 3 years. We celebrate promotions together. We spend holidays together. We call each other before anyone else when something wonderful happens or when everything falls apart." She paused, gathering enough courage to continue. "People always joke that we act like a couple." I nodded slowly. "They do." Lauren looked back at me with remarkable calm. "Have you ever wondered why neither of us argues with them very hard?" The question landed somewhere deep inside me. I opened my mouth, closed it again, and realized I had no carefully prepared executive answer for the first time in years. Every logical explanation I reached for quietly disappeared. I had told myself that our life together was simply convenient. That we happened to enjoy the same neighborhood, the same movies, the same coffee, the same peaceful evenings at home. Yet convenience had never explained why walking into an empty apartment during Lauren's weekend trips always felt strangely disappointing. It had never explained why every major success in my career somehow felt incomplete until I told her first. Lauren slowly pushed back her chair and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city reflected around her like thousands of tiny stars. Without turning around, she spoke so quietly I almost missed the words. "I have been pretending that asking nothing was safer than asking everything." She took one slow breath before adding, "I just do not know how much longer I can keep pretending." That night neither of us finished dinner. The plates remained on the table long after the food had grown cold, yet neither of us seemed to notice. Lauren disappeared into the kitchen to wash the dishes, insisting she needed something to keep her hands busy. I wandered onto the balcony overlooking the San Francisco skyline, hoping the cool evening air would quiet the storm inside my mind. It did not. Every light stretching across the city reminded me of another evening when Lauren and I had stood in the same place sharing coffee after a thunderstorm, celebrating the smallest victories as though they mattered as much as my biggest business deals. I had always believed my life was carefully organized. Every investment carried a strategy. Every decision followed logic. Yet nothing about my feelings for Lauren had ever followed a plan. The next morning I woke before sunrise, something I rarely did unless I had an international flight. As I walked toward the kitchen, I stopped in the hallway. Lauren was already there, standing barefoot beside the coffee maker wearing an oversized gray sweater, quietly humming to herself while waiting for the kettle to boil. She turned the moment she heard me. For the first time in 3 years, an awkward silence slipped between us. "Good morning," she said gently. "Morning." I reached for a mug, but our hands brushed at the same moment. We both pulled back instantly, exchanging an embarrassed smile that felt strangely unfamiliar. We had bumped into each other hundreds of times before. Somehow that tiny touch now carried a meaning neither of us could ignore. Lauren handed me the mug instead. "I made your favorite blend." "You remembered." She laughed softly. "Victoria, I buy it every month." I smiled, realizing she was right. How had I never noticed the dozens of little ways she quietly cared for me? We sat together at the kitchen island as morning sunlight slowly filled the apartment. Conversation came easily again, but everything sounded different because every ordinary sentence carried an unspoken question beneath it. She asked about my meetings. I asked about her latest design project. We smiled at familiar jokes. Yet every time our eyes met, both of us looked away a second too late. Later that afternoon, I arrived at corporate headquarters for a strategy presentation. The conference room was filled with executives discussing expansion plans, revenue forecasts, and international partnerships. I answered every question automatically, but my thoughts kept drifting somewhere entirely different. During a short break, my assistant quietly handed me a folder I had accidentally left at home that morning. "Lauren dropped this off herself," she said with a smile. "She also reminded me to make sure you actually eat lunch today." Several executives around the table laughed knowingly. One of the board members smiled and asked, "Your wife is still keeping you organized?" I opened my mouth to correct him, then stopped. Before I could answer, another executive chuckled. "Whoever she is, do not let her go. We have never seen you this happy." The room moved on to the next agenda item, but I remained completely still. I realized something uncomfortable and beautiful at exactly the same time. Every person around me had been watching my life from the outside, and somehow they had recognized a truth that I had spent years refusing to name. When I returned home that evening, Lauren was sitting on the living room floor sorting through fabric samples for a client. She looked up, smiled warmly, and without thinking asked the same question she asked every evening. "How was your day?" I stared at her for a long moment before quietly answering, "I think I finally started seeing it clearly." Lauren looked at me as though she was trying to decide whether I meant what I had just said or whether I was simply exhausted from another impossible day at the office. She set the fabric samples aside without saying a word. The apartment felt unusually peaceful as the last traces of sunset faded beyond the windows, leaving only the soft glow of the city lights reflecting across the glass. I slowly crossed the room and sat beside her on the floor. For the first time in years, I noticed details I had somehow overlooked despite seeing them every day. A small stack of design magazines rested beside her notebook. A pencil was tucked behind her ear. One of my favorite jazz records played quietly in the background because she always remembered which music helped me unwind after difficult meetings. None of those things had changed. Only the way I was seeing them had. Lauren tucked a loose strand of brown hair behind her ear and smiled nervously. "Seeing what clearly?" she asked. I glanced around the living room before answering. "This place." She looked confused. "The apartment?" I nodded. I spent years believing I loved coming home because it was beautiful. I laughed softly at myself. But it was never the penthouse. Lauren remained silent, waiting patiently the way she always did whenever she sensed I was searching for the right words. "It was you," I admitted quietly. The words surprised me almost as much as they surprised her. She lowered her eyes, and for a brief moment I thought I had said too much. Instead, she reached toward the coffee table and pulled a small wooden box closer. It was simple, worn smooth at the edges, nothing like the expensive things that filled the rest of the apartment. She rested it between us before opening the lid. Inside were dozens of tiny reminders of ordinary days. A movie ticket from our first weekend as roommates. A handwritten grocery list where I had accidentally written coffee twice. A hotel key card from the business conference where Lauren surprised me by arriving after my keynote speech because she knew I hated celebrating alone. There were pressed flowers from a walk through Golden Gate Park, postcards from short weekend trips, and instant photographs filled with smiles I barely remembered taking. I stared at the collection in complete disbelief. "You kept all of these?" I asked. Lauren nodded gently. "I never planned to." She picked up a faded receipt from a neighborhood bakery. "Then one day I realized every happy memory somehow included you." My heart tightened. I reached into the drawer beneath the coffee table almost without thinking. Hidden beneath old magazines was a black leather journal I had not opened in months. Lauren watched quietly as I placed it beside her memory box. "There is something I should probably show you." I opened to a random page. Every entry began the same way. Today Lauren laughed because. Today Lauren reminded me. Today Lauren made this place feel like home again. She looked at me with wide eyes as I slowly turned page after page. There were hundreds of entries spanning nearly 3 years. I smiled sadly. I told myself I was documenting ordinary life. Lauren's voice barely rose above a whisper. But you were documenting me. We sat together surrounded by memories neither of us had planned to collect, suddenly realizing that while we had spent years convincing ourselves we were simply sharing an apartment, both of us had quietly been building the story of a life that already looked remarkably like love. For a long time neither of us spoke. The apartment seemed to breathe with us, wrapped in the quiet comfort that had carried us through 3 years of ordinary evenings. The little wooden box and my journal rested side by side on the coffee table like two versions of the same story finally meeting each other. Lauren carefully picked up one of the instant photographs from the box. It showed us sitting on the living room floor surrounded by half-assembled furniture during my first month in the penthouse. We both looked exhausted, covered in dust, laughing because we had spent almost 2 hours building a bookshelf backward. I almost threw this picture away, she admitted with a gentle smile. I thought it was blurry. I studied the faded image. It is blurry. She nodded. But somehow it still became my favorite. I understood exactly what she meant. Some memories were never valuable because they were perfect. They mattered because they captured the feeling of being completely yourself with another person. Lauren placed the photograph back into the box before taking a slow breath. There is something I never told you. I looked at her quietly. About 6 months ago I started looking for another apartment. My heart sank before I could stop it. You did? She nodded. I thought staying here forever would make it impossible for me to move on. The words settled over me with surprising weight. I tried to imagine walking through this apartment without hearing her music in the kitchen or finding little handwritten reminders on the refrigerator telling me not to skip breakfast before an important meeting. The image felt painfully empty. Did you find one? I asked carefully. Lauren looked toward the windows where the city lights shimmered against the dark glass. I almost signed a lease last week. My chest tightened. Why did you not? She smiled sadly. Because every time I pictured leaving, I was never excited about the new place. She looked back at me with complete honesty. I was only thinking about everything I would miss here. I lowered my eyes to the journal resting in my lap. Without saying a word, I opened it near the final pages. The most recent entries no longer described business victories or ordinary routines. They had become shorter, more personal, almost like questions I had been asking myself without realizing it. Today I wondered why every success feels incomplete until Lauren smiles. Today I caught myself buying her favorite pastries without thinking. Today I almost told her she is the first person I look for every evening. Lauren quietly read the pages as I turned them. When she reached the last completed entry, she gently rested her fingertips against the paper. The final sentence was only 8 words long. I am afraid home has become one person. She closed the journal slowly, and tears filled her eyes before she even tried to hide them. Victoria, she whispered, I thought I was the only one who had been living with this secret. I shook my head. So did I. She let out a small, emotional laugh that sounded lighter than anything I had heard in days. Then her expression became thoughtful again. There is one more reason I asked you that question. She hesitated for a long moment, gathering courage one careful breath at a time. Because tomorrow morning I have to give someone my final answer, and after tomorrow, nothing between us can ever stay exactly the way it has been. The clock on the kitchen wall read 11:43, but neither of us made any attempt to go to bed. The apartment had become a place suspended between yesterday and tomorrow, where every familiar corner suddenly carried the weight of a decision that would change both of our lives. Lauren quietly closed the wooden memory box and rested her hands on top of it as though she were saying goodbye to something precious. I watched her for several seconds before finally asking the question that had been echoing inside my mind ever since she mentioned tomorrow. Who are you giving an answer to? She looked down before meeting my eyes again. The owner of the apartment I almost rented. My chest tightened. You really plan to leave? She nodded with quiet honesty. I had already packed half the boxes in my closet while you were traveling in New York last month. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. During that same trip I had spent an hour walking through a bookstore because I thought Lauren would enjoy a collection of architectural sketches I found there. I remembered smiling while imagining her reaction when I brought it home. She had been packing to leave while I was shopping for her without even realizing why. Lauren folded her hands together and spoke with remarkable calm. I told myself that if I stayed, I would spend years hoping for something that might never happen. I thought leaving would hurt once. Staying without knowing would hurt every day. Her words were impossible to argue with because I understood them completely. I had lived inside the same quiet uncertainty, only from the other side. I walked toward the windows overlooking the sleeping city and rested one hand against the cool glass. Do you know what scares me the most? I asked softly. Lauren shook her head. I built a company by making difficult decisions every single day. People think confidence comes naturally to me. I smiled sadly. The truth is that I have never been more afraid than I have been of telling you how much you matter. Lauren slowly joined me beside the window. We stood shoulder to shoulder watching headlights move through the streets far below. I almost asked you this question a year ago, she admitted. Then 6 months ago. Then 3 months ago. Every time I convinced myself that friendship was enough. She laughed quietly through gathering tears. But every time you smiled at me after walking through that front door, friendship stopped feeling like the right word. I closed my eyes for a moment because those words sounded painfully familiar. I know, I whispered. I stopped believing that word a long time ago too. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence that followed. It was no longer uncomfortable. It felt honest. Lauren reached into the pocket of her sweater and removed a folded sheet of paper. It was the unsigned lease agreement for the apartment she had almost rented. She held it carefully between her fingers before looking at me one last time. I have to send my answer by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, she said. If I say yes, I move out next week. She paused, giving me all the time in the world to speak if I wanted to. My eyes moved from the lease to her face, and for the first time I understood that tomorrow morning was never really about an apartment. It was about whether two women who had quietly loved each other through thousands of ordinary days would finally become brave enough to choose a different future together. I barely slept that night. Every hour I glanced at the clock beside my bed, knowing that each passing minute carried Lauren closer to a decision neither of us could undo. Just before sunrise I wandered into the kitchen, expecting to find the apartment empty, but she was already standing by the windows with a steaming mug wrapped between her hands. The city below was only beginning to wake, painted in soft shades of blue and gold that made everything feel strangely peaceful. She turned when she heard my footsteps and offered the same gentle smile that had welcomed me home for 3 years. You could not sleep either? She asked. I shook my head. Not after everything we said. She nodded as though she had expected that answer. We stood together in comfortable silence until the coffee maker finished brewing another pot. The familiar sound reminded me how many ordinary mornings we had shared without ever realizing they were becoming the foundation of an extraordinary life. Lauren poured another cup and placed it beside me exactly the way she always did, adding just enough cream without asking because she already knew how I liked it. I laughed quietly. You still remember? She looked almost amused. Victoria, I remember everything. Those 4 words settled deeply inside me. She remembered every birthday, every difficult meeting, every anniversary of my company, every tiny habit I had never bothered to notice about myself. Suddenly another memory surfaced with remarkable clarity. 2 years earlier I had returned from a conference in Chicago after a delayed flight. I had arrived exhausted well after midnight, convinced everyone in the apartment would already be asleep. Instead I found Lauren sitting on the couch reading a novel with a bowl of homemade soup waiting in the kitchen because she knew airline food always upset my stomach. At the time I had thanked her, smiled, and gone to bed without questioning why someone would care so deeply. Now the answer felt impossible to ignore. I looked at her carefully. "Lauren, how many times did you almost tell me?" She smiled with quiet honesty. "More times than I can count." She looked toward the sunrise before continuing. "Every holiday. Every birthday. Every time you celebrated another business milestone. Every evening you came home looking exhausted and still asked me how my day had been before talking about your own." She laughed softly. "I even practiced the conversation while driving home from the grocery store." I could not help smiling through the emotion building inside me. "Why did you never say it?" She took a slow breath. "Because I thought if you did not feel the same, I would lose the most important friendship of my life." I closed my eyes for a moment because her fear had been my own. "Lauren, I turned down dates that my friends insisted would be perfect for me." She looked at me with surprise. "Why?" I smiled sadly. "Because every time someone asked what I wanted in a partner, I described you without realizing it." Her eyes filled with tears that she no longer tried to hide. Neither of us needed another explanation. Years of confusion quietly dissolved beneath one simple truth. We had never failed to find love. We had simply spent too long calling it something else. Lauren glanced at the clock on the wall. 8:27. Only 33 minutes remained before she had to answer the email waiting in her inbox. She reached into her pocket, unlocked her phone, and opened the message without pressing anything. Then she placed the screen on the kitchen counter between us. "Victoria," she whispered with calm sincerity, "before I decide where I am going to live, I need to know whether I have already been home all along." The apartment remained completely still. The only sound came from the quiet ticking of the clock and the distant hum of the city waking beneath us. 8:29. I looked at the phone resting on the kitchen counter, then back at Lauren. For 3 years I had believed courage belonged in boardrooms, negotiations, and impossible business decisions. Standing there, I realized real courage had nothing to do with billion-dollar contracts. It was found in ordinary kitchens on ordinary mornings, when two people finally stopped protecting themselves from the truth. Lauren never rushed me. She simply waited with the same patience she had shown every evening I came home late, every weekend I buried myself in reports, every moment she quietly believed I would eventually notice what had been right in front of me all along. I stepped closer until only a few inches separated us. "Do you remember the first night you moved in?" I asked softly. She smiled through uncertain eyes. "You ordered too much pizza because you thought one large pie would not be enough for 2 people." I laughed quietly. "I also bought flowers for the dining table." She nodded. "You said the apartment did not feel lived in yet." I looked around the bright kitchen where every corner carried a memory of us. I was wrong. She tilted her head slightly. "About what?" I smiled. "It never became a home because of the furniture or the view." My voice grew quieter with every word. "It became home because every room eventually held a memory of you." Lauren lowered her eyes as tears gathered once again. She whispered my name so softly it almost disappeared into the morning light. I reached toward the phone resting between us, not to open the email but simply to slide it gently aside. Then I took both of her hands in mine. It felt like the most natural thing I had ever done. "Lauren," I said, "you asked me whether we have spent 3 years pretending we were only roommates." She nodded without speaking. "The truth is that I have spent 3 years pretending I did not know why I hurried home every evening." A small smile appeared through her tears. I continued before fear could interrupt me again. "Every success I celebrated felt incomplete until I shared it with you. Every difficult day became easier because I knew you would be waiting in the kitchen asking how I was doing before talking about yourself. I kept telling everyone I was fortunate to have an incredible roommate." I shook my head gently. "I was wrong about that too." Lauren searched my face as though she wanted to remember every second forever. "Then what was I?" she asked. I smiled with a calm certainty that surprised even me. You have been the person I was building my life around without realizing it. Neither of us spoke for several long seconds. We did not need to. Years of unanswered questions quietly dissolved inside that simple truth. I picked up her phone, closed the apartment rental email without replying, and placed it back into her hands. I cannot decide your future for you, I said gently. But I can tell you something I should have said a long time ago. She waited, her eyes never leaving mine. I took one slow breath before finally allowing my heart to speak without hesitation. If you are still wondering where you belong, then stay here with me, not because we are roommates anymore, but because I do not want to imagine another ordinary morning that does not begin with you. 1 year later, I unlocked the front door carrying 2 cups of coffee instead of one, smiling before I even stepped inside because I already knew what I would find. Lauren was standing in the middle of the living room surrounded by fabric samples, paint swatches, and sketches spread across the floor exactly the way she always worked when inspiration arrived. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, filling every corner of the penthouse with a warmth that had nothing to do with the weather outside. She looked up the moment she heard me, and that familiar smile still had the remarkable ability to make every difficult meeting, every long flight, and every demanding decision disappear before I even set my briefcase down. Perfect timing, she laughed. I cannot decide between these 2 colors. I handed her one of the coffees before kneeling beside her. You know I will always choose whichever one makes you smile first. She shook her head, pretending to be disappointed. That is not very helpful for an interior designer. Maybe not, I answered, but it has worked for me. We both laughed, and I realized how different laughter sounded when it was no longer protecting a secret. The apartment had changed over the past year, but not because of expensive renovations or new furniture. Lauren had filled it with photographs from weekend road trips, shelves lined with books we chose together, fresh flowers that somehow always appeared before I noticed they were missing, and quiet little reminders that a beautiful home is created by shared moments rather than expensive things. My awards still stood in the study, but they no longer felt like the center of my life. They had become memories of a career, while the rooms around us had become memories of a future we were building together. Above the fireplace hung a simple wooden frame that visitors often stopped to read. Inside rested a small handwritten note on ordinary stationery. Can I ask you something crazy? Beneath it, written in my own handwriting months later, were the words that had finally changed everything. I had been waiting years for you to ask. People sometimes assumed it was part of a piece of artwork. Only Lauren and I knew it had once been the beginning of the bravest conversation either of us had ever started. That afternoon we carried another box into the storage room. It was filled with little reminders we could never bring ourselves to throw away. The first grocery list we had written together. The faded movie ticket. The coffee receipt from our favorite neighborhood cafe. The photograph of the backward bookshelf that still made us laugh every time we saw it. We added my old journal beside Lauren's wooden memory box, closing the lid gently before placing it on the highest shelf. Do you think we will ever stop collecting memories? Lauren asked softly. I looked around the home we had created together and smiled. I hope not. She slipped her hand into mine with the same quiet certainty that had always been there, only now neither of us felt the need to hide it behind another name. Looking back, I realized my life had never changed because I became more successful or because I learned to make better decisions. It changed because one ordinary evening, after thousands of ordinary days, the woman who had quietly become my favorite part of every morning finally found the courage to ask one simple question, and for the first time in my life, I found the courage to answer it with complete honesty. Sometimes the greatest love stories do not begin with extraordinary moments at all. Sometimes they begin the day 2 best friends stop pretending they are only roommates and finally discover they have been home in each other's hearts all along.